Welcome to the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us in the studio today. We're going to be discussing an editorial published in the journal Clean Technologies and Environmental Policy. It explores the really multifaceted challenges and opportunities tied to this huge global shift away from fossil fuels towards a low-carbon economy. So this deep dive, we're going to unpack the complexities of moving from, a fossil-based economy to one powered by low-carbon sources. We'll reveal some surprising facts and key insights from this expert editorial. The piece essentially asks, how is this transition actually going, and how will our low-carbon future really unfold? Crucially, it offers, and I'm quoting here, question marks and prescriptions rather than predictions.
That's right. It's a really important distinction. We're not claiming to have a crystal ball. The goal is more to understand the intricate web of factors involved. The interdependencies are key. It's far more complex than just swapping out one energy source for another.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What's the fundamental goal here, and what kind of time frame are we looking at for this massive transition? It sounds urgent.
The primary target is, ambitious. It's about reducing carbon intensity quite significantly and doing it in a relatively short time frame. We're talking maybe 1 to 2 decades. The aim, of course, is to limit global warming. The main drivers are greenhouse gas emissions, primarily from burning fossil fuels, and also land use changes contribute, though, to a lesser extent.
1 or 2 decades.
Yeah.
Wow. That feels incredibly fast for a global energy system overhaul. What are the immediate challenges the editorial points to, especially with that kind of timeline pressure?
Well, right off the bat, you're looking at huge investments, very high initial costs. And the returns on these investments, they're often uncertain, sometimes quite distant in the future. This uncertainty is amplified by things like shifting policy outcomes, potential disruptions from new technologies popping up, and just the sheer capital intensity needed. It costs a lot of money.
So it's not just the sticker price, but the risk and the long way for any payoff. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Does the editorial get into the geopolitical?
Oh, definitely not. That's a critical layer. Different nations have really different social and political views on this transition. What's fascinating here is how many see it as a chance to, fundamentally shift the economic and political balance of power. It's an opportunity to reshape the global landscape, gain energy independence, that sort of thing.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears to the tech side. For power generation and industry, the editorial mentions 2 main routes. Retrofitting existing plants or deploying new low-carbon tech. Let's start with retrofitting, specifically carbon capture and storage, CCS, and utilization, CCU. What are the big drawbacks for CCS?
CCS faces some pretty significant hurdles. First, the geology isn't helpful everywhere. Suitable places to store carbon underground aren't evenly spread out, and they're often far from where the CO2 is actually produced. That means transport infrastructure.
Logistical nightmare, basically.
It can be, yeah. Then there's public perception. People worry about potential leaks or even minor earthquakes-induced seismicity, even though the actual probability of major leakage is considered remote. And a big one, legally speaking, is the lack of a clear regulatory framework for long-term liability. Who's responsible 50, 100 years down the line if something goes wrong? Plus, there's a massive, almost shocking scale mismatch. The amount of CO2 we project we need to store to hit climate goals is vastly, vastly larger than the total amount we've actually managed to inject underground so far. The scale is just mind-boggling.
That really does put the scale challenge front and center. Okay, so what about CCU, carbon capture, and utilization? Is the idea there to make money from the CO2 to make it more appealing?
Exactly. CCU aims to monetize the captured CO2. The goal is either to reduce the net cost of capturing it or ideally actually turn a profit. Enhanced oil recovery, EOR, is probably the best-known large-scale example. You use CO2 to push out more oil from existing wells.
So the CO2 has value in that context.
Right. But CCU has its own bottlenecks. Chemically, CO2 is incredibly stable. It takes a lot of energy, high temperatures, high pressure to get it to react, even with advanced catalysts. And if the reaction isn't complete, you need even more energy to separate the products and recycle the leftover CO2. If that extra energy comes from fossil fuels, you might actually reduce the overall benefit in terms of net avoided emissions.
Kind of defeats the purpose a bit.
It potentially can, yes. And there's another scale mismatch issue here, too. The potential market for chemicals made from CO2 is often much smaller than the sheer volume of CO2 being produced by major industries. We just don't need that much of the end products compared to the CO2 available.
Right, okay. This is where it gets really interesting. Incentives. How do we actually speed this stuff up? What does the editorial say about policy levers for CCS or CCUS?
Carbon pricing policy is highlighted as a key accelerator. If you put a price on emitting carbon, suddenly capturing it becomes more economically viable. It creates a direct incentive.
Makes sense. Pay to pollute or invest not to.
Precisely. But then you run into the reality of existing infrastructure. We have this massive, globally distributed network built around fossil fuels, and it has a very long lifespan. This creates what's called technology lock-in. Even with all the talk about climate change, there have been significant recent investments in oil and gas exploration and production. This existing infrastructure, all that invested capital, makes it really hard to pivot quickly. It raises a big question. How do you shift away from something so embedded?
That lock-in effect sounds like a huge barrier.
Oh,
Okay, we've talked about capturing carbon from existing sources, but what about the push for new low-carbon technologies? What's driving that side of the equation?
there are several drivers. Technology itself is one. Wind and solar, for instance, have just gotten dramatically cheaper and better over time. They're moving down their learning curves, becoming cost competitive in many places. Then there are social and political factors. Energy security is a big one, especially for countries that don't have their own fossil fuel reserves. For them, developing domestic renewables isn't just about climate, it's a strategic must-have.
And beyond just being clean, what are the broader economic impacts? Are we talking real growth, jobs?
Yes, definitely. Solar PV and wind are proven technologies now. They supply energy, obviously, but they also create jobs, actually. Studies suggest they're more job-intensive than oil and gas per unit of energy. So, yes, they can be significant drivers of economic growth. But again, challenges remain. They often need help crossing the technology death valley, that period, before they're fully cost competitive on their own. Government incentives are usually needed to compete against cheap, abundant fossil fuels and all that existing infrastructure we talked about.
And the reliability issue. The whole sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow.
Yeah.
How does the editorial tackle that?
That's a major hurdle for grid operators, no doubt. Renewables are inherently variable, vulnerable to weather patterns. This intermittency affects the stability and reliability of the power system. So you need solutions. That might mean having fast-reacting gas plants on standby for backup. Or it could involve moving towards more distributed energy grids, using smart technology to manage demand-shifting usage to times when supply is high.
Requires a smarter grid. That's it.
Exactly. And you also need significant expansion of the transmission network to connect these often remote renewable sources with population centers and backup power plants. It's also worth remembering that some sectors are much harder to decarbonize than power generation. Think heavy industries like steel, cement, chemicals. They need really high temperatures, currently provided almost exclusively by fossil fuels. Finding low-carbon alternatives there is a much bigger technological leap.
Okay, let's pivot to another huge sector. Transport. How we move ourselves and goods around. What are the low-carbon options there, according to the editorial?
The main pathways discussed are vehicles powered by electricity, hydrogen, or biofuels. Electric vehicles, EVs, have a tiny market share right now, globally speaking, but that's expected to grow fast as more countries set phase-out dates for traditional internal combustion engines.
But it takes time for the fleet to turn over, right?
Exactly, that's the fleet inertia problem. Even if all new cars sold were electric tomorrow, it would take many years for the existing gasoline and diesel cars to disappear from the roads. So the impact on the overall carbon footprint is delayed.
What about hydrogen for transport? Is that close?
The technology for hydrogen fuel cell cars and light buses is actually quite mature, technology readiness level 7 or 8, which is pretty high. But the cost is still, well, prohibitively expensive for widespread adoption right now.
And biofuels. Are they a viable solution?
It's complicated. First-generation biofuels made from food crops like corn or sugarcane aren't seen as ideal long-term because they compete with food production. That raises ethical and land use issues. Second-generation biofuels, made from things like agricultural waste or non-food crops, are more promising but still struggle with costs. For aviation, synthetic kerosene, e-kerosene is technically possible, but again, very expensive. It would likely need strong regulations or significant subsidies to take off, literally and figuratively.
You mentioned hydrogen. If we zoom out, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, projects a massive increase in hydrogen demand overall, doesn't it? Not just for transport?
Yes. The IEA forecast, based on pledges, sees a potential 7-fold increase in hydrogen demand by 2070. They see it playing a crucial role as an energy carrier, a feedstock for industry, and a fuel across various sectors. This will likely require both green hydrogen made using renewable electricity through electrolysis and blue hydrogen made from natural gas, but with the carbon emissions captured using CCS. There's also exciting potential for net negative emissions using biohydrogen. That's hydrogen made from biomass or biomethane, again coupled with CCS, or even just burning biomass for heat and power, but capturing the CO2 that's called BECCS, bioenergy with CCS. These negative emissions technologies become increasingly important the tighter our climate targets get.
Net negative, that's a whole other level. This all sounds incredibly complex and frankly expensive. Are there innovative financial tools emerging beyond just carbon taxes or regulations to help drive this?
Yes, the editorial points to tradable decarbonization credits as a really interesting policy innovation. California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard, LCFS, is one example. Another is Brazil's Renova Bio program, which issues these things called CBIOs. Importantly, CBIOs aren't a direct subsidy. They're a carbon trading mechanism. Biofuel producers who meet certain carbon intensity reduction targets earn these credits, which they can then sell. It creates an extra revenue stream based purely on their environmental performance.
So it's a market-based incentive.
Exactly, and it seems to be working. The editorial notes that by early 2021, over 200 ethanol plants in Brazil were certified under Renova Bio. It shows how you can use market forces to drive decarbonization in specific sectors.
So listening to all of this, the different technologies, the policy needs, the economic barriers, the geographic variations, it really hammers home the point that there's no single silver bullet solution here, is there?
That's absolutely the core message. The future isn't one technology replacing another overnight. It's going to be an ensemble of site-dependent solutions. What works best will depend on local conditions, costs, social acceptance, geography, all sorts of factors. And these alternatives will likely evolve gradually. It's also important to realize how much the ambition of our targets affects things. For example, aiming to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius versus, say, 2 degrees significantly speeds up the required transition timeline. And that acceleration intensifies the potential side effects. The EIA, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, estimated that moving the net zero target from 2070 up to 2050 would demand about 50% more deployment of CCUS globally. That's a huge jump.
What are some of those side effects, maybe the less obvious ones, that come with such a massive global shift?
Well, beyond the direct economics, there are significant environmental considerations. Large-scale solar and wind farms, or biomass cultivation, have their own impacts, particularly concerning water use and land use changes. We need land for panels, turbines, crops.
Trade-offs everywhere.
Indeed. And socioeconomically, the decline of fossil fuels means stranding assets, leaving valuable reserves in the ground. This will cause major losses for oil and gas producing nations and lead to job losses in those industries. While renewables create new jobs, they might not be in the same places or require the same skills. So you're looking at workforce retraining needs, potential regional economic disruption. This uncertainty is particularly acute for the big emerging economies, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. By 2030, they could represent a huge chunk of global GDP, population, and economic growth. How they navigate this transition is critical and complex.
And external shocks like the recent pandemic. Did COVID-19 throw a wrench in the works?
It definitely did. It slowed things down. Tighter national budgets meant governments deferred or reduced support for renewable projects in some cases. And supply chain disruptions hit hard, especially for things like solar panels coming out of China and East Asia. It caused real delays. It underscores a key point the editorial makes about foresight. The future rarely unfolds exactly as predicted, especially when there's a strong consensus view. While planning and roadmaps are useful, they can sometimes engineer expectations in a way that influences development, but might also marginalize dissenting views or alternative pathways.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it seems the journey to a low-carbon world isn't just about engineering or economics. It's a fundamental reordering of almost everything, global economies, jobs, geopolitics, land use. It really leaves us with a crucial question to ponder. How do we effectively balance the undeniable urgency of tackling climate change with the messy, complex realities of our human systems, our existing economies, and that powerful force of inertia? Thank you so much for walking us through this complex landscape today. Really fascinating insights.
My pleasure. It's a critical conversation to be having.
And thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We hope this gave you a clearer, perhaps more nuanced view of the monumental task and the varied pathways ahead.